Luis accidentally witnessed a traffic accident and for some reason discovered a huge business opportunity. He realized that every time there is an accident, a crowd of people like zombies rushes to the scene, taking photos from every angle, even shoving cameras into the victims' faces. Seeing the madness of these people, Luis immediately became curious. After they finished taking pictures, Luis approached one of them to learn the reason behind their actions. It turned out that this group sold news footage to television stations for commissions. However, when Luis asked how much money could be made from such footage, the person gave an ambiguous answer, clearly unwilling to disclose this to outsiders. But when Luis saw the expensive equipment in their car, he was sure this must be a lucrative job. Realizing this, Luis immediately suggested joining them but was flatly rejected with the words, "Never." Luis was about to try to convince them further, but at that moment a new accident was announced on the radio. The man quickly called his team, and they got into the car to head to the scene. Rejected but not discouraged, Luis felt even more excited. He had been a jobless man living off stealing scrap metal and manhole covers. Every time he sold the stolen goods at the scrapyard, the shopkeeper would haggle wildly, clearly knowing his line of work. This meant that every theft Luis carried out hardly earned him anything. Eventually, Luis decided he needed to find a legitimate job. However, due to the terrible job market and his lack of experience, no one would hire him. In the end, he even offered to work for free as an intern at the scrapyard, but the owner paid him no attention. "I'm not hiring a thief." Luis's mood plummeted. He felt his future was as uncertain as walking through fog. But just when Luis thought he would remain lost forever, the scene at the accident site sparked a glimmer of hope in his heart. Back home, Luis turned on the TV early, flipping through every news channel until he quickly found the report about last night's accident. A spark of excitement began to ignite within him. Soon after, he went to the park and chose an expensive bicycle as his target. Waiting until the owner stepped away, Luis sold the bike for $800 and used the money to buy a camera and a police scanner. If no one was going to guide him into the profession, Luis decided he would figure it out himself. That evening, Luis parked his car by the roadside, intently listening to the information coming through the police scanner. However, he quickly realized he had underestimated how difficult this job could be. Just deciphering the police codes and the transmissions gave him a headache, not to mention filtering out useful information. After hours of study, he finally managed to understand that a brawl had just occurred 5 kilometers away. Thrilled, he immediately started his car and headed to the scene. When Luis arrived at the scene, the police had already been there for a while, but his new colleagues were nowhere to be found. Without overthinking, Luis jumped right in and started filming. However, within moments, the police asked him to leave. Reluctantly, he moved on to the next location. All night, Luis ran from one place to another, but all he managed to capture were a few brawls and some drunk drivers. Due to being chased away by the police, his footage was worthless. Things changed when Luis stopped to refuel and heard on the radio about a shooting incident. He immediately recognized this as major news and sped to the scene. Once there, however, the police and rescue teams were already present and his colleagues were busy filming and photographing. Determined to make the most of the situation, Luis tried to set up his camera like a professional, only to realize his equipment was nothing compared to theirs. Even if he managed to film something, no station would want to buy his footage. Faced with this reality, Luis decided to take a risk. He pushed past the rescue team to get closer to the victim and secretly filmed their injuries. Unfortunately, the police caught him again and forced him to leave, causing trouble for the other reporters as well. Some of them cursed at Luis, but didn't hold a grudge as they had already finished their footage and were busy calling television stations. Luis discreetly followed them and eavesdropped on their conversation, eventually learning that his colleagues had sold their footage for $300. Hearing such an appealing amount of money, Luis decided to try his luck at the TV station. However, when he presented his footage to the producer, they showed no interest as they had already received similar footage earlier. Luis quickly explained, "I was there, I was even closer." This statement caught their attention. Liza, the station manager, needed shocking visuals to captivate viewers. Although Luis's footage was slightly blurry and somewhat graphic, Liza nodded in agreement. In the end, Luis sold the first footage of his life for $250. When he received the money, Luis seized the opportunity to ask Liza about something he had been curious about for a while. He wanted to know what kind of news TV stations were really interested in, since he had noticed that fights or drunk driving incidents were often ignored and he was frequently chased off by the police. Liza explained that not all stories attract an audience. TV stations know viewers are usually drawn to stories about crime, especially those involving racial issues. Additionally, news about public safety such as house fires and car accidents also garnered significant interest. Hearing this, Luis had an epiphany. Confident in his ability to learn quickly, he promised Liza that she would see him again soon. The next day, when Luis saw his footage broadcast on television, he felt both excitement and a sense of accomplishment. This fueled his motivation to push forward. After reflecting on his failures the previous night, Luis went online to research all the police codes and memorized them to gather information faster. Realizing he couldn't handle everything on his own, Luis decided to find an assistant to improve his efficiency. He eventually interviewed a man named Jerry, a homeless individual who had been out of work for 6 months. Unable to afford rent, Jerry was sleeping in subway stations and desperately needed a job. After lengthy negotiations, Luis hired Jerry for a very low wage of $30 per night. To help Jerry quickly adapt, Luis patiently taught him the police codes he had recently learned, and together they waited for nightfall. Finally, a report of a fire came through on the radio. They immediately set off for the scene, with Luis driving and Jerry navigating using a map. However, their first collaboration didn't go smoothly. Luis drove too fast and kept pressuring Jerry, who panicked and gave the wrong directions. They ended up taking a long detour before finally arriving at the scene. By the time they got there, their competitors had already finished filming and were preparing to leave. The mockery from the others annoyed Luis, but he kept his frustration to himself. He knew that maintaining good communication was key to resolving problems. Later, they headed to the scene of a shooting. However, the police had sealed off the area and Luis couldn't get inside. Instead, he resorted to interviewing bystanders outside, but the footage wasn't sellable. Realizing that if he didn't take more initiative, the night could end without any usable material, Luis began scanning the scene for opportunities. After a moment of observation, he noticed the back door of the house was unguarded. Taking a significant risk of being charged with trespassing, Luis sneaked inside with his camera in hand. Once inside, he filmed everything he could see. Finally, 2 bullet holes on the refrigerator caught his attention. Placing a family photo of the victims next to the bullet holes, he created a shockingly dramatic image. The stark contrast between the innocent family portrait and the violence implied by the bullet holes evoked a powerful sense of tragedy and injustice. Luis continued filming until he was satisfied with the footage, completely disregarding the potential consequences of tampering with a crime scene. When he presented the footage to the station, Liza was astonished, especially by the photo of the family next to the bullet holes. The contrast in the image conveyed the story of innocent citizens in the city falling victim to cold-blooded criminals without mercy. Although the editor-in-chief recognized that Luis's filming methods could pose legal risks, Liza didn't care. Her sole focus was on viewership ratings. She was indifferent to how the footage was obtained. This disregard for ethics and the law made Luis start to admire Liza. In turn, Liza began to see potential in Luis. For someone new to the field, to capture such impactful images was rare. Luis then said something that further elevated his standing in Liza's eyes, revealing his determination to find his direction. Answer this question: what do I love? What am I good at? What am I not good at? Recently, I reviewed my list and realized that perhaps television news is something I love and maybe even something I'm good at. When Liza left, only Luis remained in the broadcast room. After 2 successful attempts, he believed he had discovered his path to success. He sat on a podium with the city skyline behind him, as if declaring himself the future king of this city. At that moment, Luis's ambition exploded. In the days that followed, he worked obsessively. His filming methods became increasingly graphic and gruesome, while ethics and the law began to fade in his view. His footage consistently outshone that of his competitors, leading to his stories appearing more frequently on television. Within 2 months, Luis had already bought a new car. However, the constant exposure to violent and bloody scenes began to take a toll on his psyche, pushing him toward a disturbing state of mind. When his assistant accidentally spilled gas on his car while refueling, Luis didn't hesitate to berate him. "You just spilled gas on my car. That will ruin the paint. I advise you to be more careful, because if you do that again, I'll fire you on the spot." With upgraded equipment, Luis also drove faster to reach scenes as quickly as possible. Running red lights had become a routine habit. Even more astonishingly, one night when Luis arrived at the scene of an accident before the police and his competitors, he noticed that even the people involved were still reporting the incident to the authorities. Luis quickly surveyed the scene, found the best angle, and started filming, yet he felt that something was missing in the footage. Without hesitation, he put the camera down, approached the victim lying on the ground, and rearranged them into a position he deemed more suitable for the shot. With a satisfied smile, he resumed filming. By the time the police arrived at the scene, Luis had already completed his footage. They had no idea the scene had been altered by him. Luis's success, though ethically questionable, was grounded in his understanding that in this industry results were all that mattered. No one cared about the process. His bold filming style and lightning-fast speed caught the attention of a senior figure in the field. This veteran hoped Luis would join his team, as he had just upgraded his equipment and expanded operations. With Luis on board, they could share insider connections with the police, double their income, and even dominate the market entirely. For Luis, this opportunity was undoubtedly a chance to take his career to the next level. However, after his meteoric success over the past 2 months, Luis had grown arrogant and had no intention of sharing his slice of the pie with anyone, especially someone who had once rejected him. "I have no interest whatsoever," Luis coldly declined the offer. He had his own plans for his career and didn't intend to involve anyone else. He set his sights on Liza, the head of the TV station. As night fell, Luis brought his footage to the station and took the chance to invite Liza to dinner. However, Liza was no pushover. She immediately saw through his intentions. She claimed to have principles, stating that she never got involved with colleagues, especially since she was 2 years older than Luis. But Luis was unfazed. He boldly declared that he had become the station's primary source of news content and that Liza's decisions would directly impact viewer ratings. His words hit Liza's weak spot, and she ultimately agreed to a simple dinner, unaware that this was all the opportunity Luis needed. During dinner, Luis quickly steered the conversation toward Liza's work. He had already analyzed the station's situation thoroughly. Crime news was the backbone of maintaining viewer ratings, and over the past 2 months, nearly all crime-related stories had been supplied by Luis. This not only demonstrated Luis's value, but also revealed something critical. Throughout her career, Liza had never renewed a contract at any company for more than 2 years. With only a few weeks left until her contract renewal decision, she was under immense pressure. As the head of the station, Liza was obligated to maintain high viewer ratings. Failing to do so could jeopardize her chances of securing another job at her age. Luis understood how vital he had become to Liza's career. He used this as leverage to make an outrageous demand. It wasn't that Luis genuinely liked Liza. He saw her as a stepping stone, a gateway to her extensive social network that could help him further his career. Luis dared to make his brazen proposition because he was confident he had Liza cornered. If she wanted to keep her job and health insurance, she had no choice but to comply. After an internal struggle, Liza ultimately gave in, and Luis had successfully outmaneuvered her. But just as Liza was reveling in her success, bad luck struck. That night, Luis received news about a plane crash. Since the crash site was located on the outskirts, he arrived late, and by the time he got there, everything had been sealed off. To his surprise, the person he had turned down for collaboration earlier that day was the first to emerge from the scene. The sound of crying echoed into the sky. Everything was reduced to ashes by the fire. Exclusive news: I'm going to make it big. It turned out that since upgrading his equipment, his senior colleague had always been quicker in gathering information. Thanks to an expanded team, Luis was no longer a competitor to him. When Luis returned to the station, Liza found out that he hadn't managed to get the news about the plane crash while other channels had already broadcasted it. Liza immediately erupted in anger, scolding Luis. She had placed all her trust in him, even sacrificing her own integrity. Yet when it mattered most, Luis had failed. The look of disappointment in Liza's eyes hit Luis like a slap to the face. Gradually, Luis's own gaze became cold and distant. When he got home and saw his senior's report airing on TV, he couldn't control his anger any longer. Luis was no longer calm. He was like a wild animal, enraged and desperately venting his fury. He absolutely wouldn't allow his plan to be destroyed. At that moment, a cruel plan formed in his mind. If he couldn't solve the problem, he would take care of the one causing it. Luis secretly sabotaged his senior's car. That night, Luis ignored a fire and instead took a detour to a more distant accident scene. When he arrived, his assistant was stunned to find that the person involved in the accident was his senior. "Hey, don't film, that's one of ours." "Not anymore, we're professionals now, he's just news." Luis calmly set up his camera and approached his senior. Despite the senior's intense stare, Luis showed no remorse and calmly finished filming. Afterward, he resumed his usual hunt for stories throughout the city. Soon after, Luis targeted a theft in a wealthy neighborhood. In just 5 minutes, he arrived at the scene with the police and his colleagues still nowhere to be seen. Luis immediately rushed into the villa thinking it was just a typical burglary. But then he heard gunshots and realized he had gotten lucky. He quickly turned off his lights and began filming. Not long after, he saw 2 murderers from the villa trying to escape. Luis swiftly hid in the bushes, but he didn't forget to keep filming. Thanks to this, he was able to capture footage of them and even their car's license plate. After confirming they had left, Luis quickly entered the villa. Upon seeing the disfigured body in the living room, his heart raced, but at the same time a rush of excitement erupted within him. This was the first time Luis had encountered such a dramatic scene. He couldn't stop changing angles to capture every detail of the victims. He then continued exploring the villa with his camera as if embarking on a terrifying adventure. In the bedroom and kitchen, Luis discovered 2 more people. Once he finished filming and was about to leave the villa, his assistant arrived. When his assistant asked about what had happened, Luis revealed nothing and quickly drove away from the scene with his assistant. As they passed by the police cars, the police still had no idea that the crime scene had already been taken over by Luis. After leaving the scene, Luis had no intention of handing over the evidence to the police. He parked by the roadside and began editing the footage he had just filmed. He deliberately deleted the parts showing the criminals, keeping only the scenes of him entering the villa. In his mind, Luis already had an even crazier plan. When Luis submitted the footage to the television station, everyone was shocked. The disturbing realistic images in the footage were filmed in a horror style, taking the shock value of the video to a whole new level. To ensure it was broadcasted, Liza had to seek permission from the highest authority at the station. After a heated debate, they decided to blur the faces of all the victims. However, when it came to the price of the footage, Luis demanded $15,000. Liza couldn't agree because that amount was the entire monthly budget for her station, and she couldn't afford to spend all that money on a single news report. But Luis was very firm. He told Liza that if the footage was aired, it would cause fear throughout the city and everyone would pay attention to the developments of the case. He also promised to find a way to get the latest updates on the case. At that point, Liza's contract wouldn't be an issue anymore. Not only did Luis demand money, but he also requested that the television station include his company's name when broadcasting the footage. In addition, he wanted Liza to help him build relationships within the station to pave the way for his future. Luis calmly said to Liza, "I also want to stop arguing about the price. To save time, when I mention a figure, it's my lowest price, and you can rest assured that I thought this through before giving you this number. Now, when I say I want these things, I mean I really want them, and I don't want to repeat myself. The last thing I want, Liza, is that when we're alone in your apartment, I want you to do as I ask. Don't act like last time." Each time Luis finished a sentence, he took another step closer to Liza. She felt as though she was being surrounded by a wild animal, with herself as the small prey. The pressure from Luis made it hard for her to breathe. That night, Liza introduced Luis to everyone at the station and shared stories related to him. After finishing the report, it began airing. To increase its impact, the station not only added tense background music, but the anchor also repeatedly emphasized that the killer was still on the run after the massacre. Meanwhile, Liza followed Luis's requests, ensuring the anchor mentioned Luis's company name several times. These embellishments helped the news report gain widespread attention, and within one night, Luis's company name became well known. However, the next day the police came to find Luis. Thanks to the news segment from the previous night, Luis was well prepared. He explained that he had seen the killer, but because it was dark he couldn't make a clear identification. As for the footage, it was filmed after he entered the villa. The police didn't doubt his statement, so they copied the footage and left. However, they didn't know that it was all part of Luis's plan, as the next step would turn his words into evidence to clear him of any wrongdoing. Later, Luis tracked down the footage of the killer. Using the license plate number, he found their address. That evening, Liza began to act early. To persuade assistant Jerry to cooperate, he raised Jerry's salary to $75 and promised a bright future, even though that seemed unlikely to happen. Once Jerry was eager, Luis revealed his plan. He intended to go to the killer's house to confirm their identity, report it to the police, and record the entire arrest process. Given the killer's violent nature, a shootout was almost certain, and that would make for an incredibly shocking news story. They went to the killer's house and waited. During this time, Luis casually mentioned that he would make $50,000 that night. This statement made Jerry feel dissatisfied, thinking that while they were doing the same thing, he was only receiving a few dozen dollars. Jerry suggested they split the profits. If not, he would report Luis's actions. Luis looked at Jerry in disbelief. He never expected his once obedient assistant would dare to threaten him. After some consideration, Luis decided to compromise and offer Jerry $10,000, but Jerry refused. Upon hearing the refusal, Luis's face turned cold. His gaze at Jerry was as if he were already dead, but not wanting to disrupt his plan, Luis temporarily agreed to Jerry's demand. After some time, the killer finally left the house. Luis quietly followed him. During this time, the killer picked up another accomplice, and after several turns they stopped at a restaurant. Luis immediately called the police, describing the killer in detail and reminding them that they were armed. Right after hanging up, the radio station announced that the police were on their way to the scene. Luis knew the police were approaching and arranged for Jerry to stand across from the restaurant to record the entire event while he stayed in the car and filmed from a different angle. However, at that moment, Jerry suddenly became afraid that he might be noticed by the killer while filming and would be in danger, so he stubbornly refused to leave the car. Luis was furious at Jerry for backing out at such a critical moment, to the point where he felt like shooting him right then and there. Luis coldly told Jerry, "If I truly harmed you over this, I think you'd believe that joining the plan and backing out at the last minute would have been a mistake." Jerry realized the threat in Luis's voice and in the end gritted his teeth and stepped out of the car. After Jerry set up the camera, the police arrived. However, they didn't act immediately but pretended to be customers entering the restaurant. While ordering, they secretly observed the killer. Upon noticing the police, the killer quietly drew his gun and became alert. Less than 2 minutes later, another police car arrived intending to take a similar approach, but as soon as they stepped into the restaurant, the killer immediately opened fire. Instantly, both sides had people shot down. One of the killers, though injured, managed to escape and drove off. The police immediately gave chase while Luis and Jerry stayed close behind, recording the entire pursuit. Due to the high speed, the pursuing police car was hit by another vehicle and overturned when it crossed the intersection. But Luis didn't stop and continued to chase the killer's car. Soon after, another police car arrived in pursuit. The vehicles collided repeatedly and eventually all crashed. Luis quickly got out of the car, grabbed his camera, and signaled to Jerry that the killer was dead, telling him to come film. But when Jerry walked closer to the killer's car with the camera, he was shot on the spot. The killer staggered out of the car, saw Luis holding the camera, but before he could react, the sound of a police siren blared. The killer tried to flee but was shot down by the police. Afterward, Luis brought the camera in front of his assistant. "I saw him. I can't harm the company's interests to protect an untrustworthy employee." "You're crazy. You learned how to bargain from me and then used the same trick on me. Admit it." "I don't know. I know everything from finding news to creating news, from eliminating rivals to clearing out the competition." Luis, from someone who just wanted a decent job, has now transformed into a dark demon. What caused his transformation wasn't just his growing ambition, but also his sharpness in the news industry. Afterward, Luis brought the footage to the TV station. As he walked through the hallway, he could easily name every person by name. His calm demeanor suggested he had already forgotten the death of his assistant. Liza watched the footage shocked yet simultaneously captivated by Luis's charm. However, before the news aired, the editor-in-chief received information from the police. It turned out that after searching the killer's house, they found a large amount of flour. They discovered the case was actually a gang conflict, not the cold-blooded murder of an entire family. Surprisingly, after hearing this, Liza refused to change the story's angle because she knew the audience wanted to see urban crime stories. At this moment, Liza seemed to have been infected by Luis, no longer a media professional concerned with the accuracy of the news, but someone who would stop at nothing to achieve her goals, just like Luis. Soon after the news aired, Luis was summoned to the police station. It turned out that during the investigation, the police discovered that the person who had reported the crime the day before was him. By connecting the two cases and the footage from the previous day's news report, the police suspected that Luis had known about the situation from the beginning but didn't report it. Instead, he deliberately set a trap to gather material for the news. This resulted in the unfortunate sacrifice of a police officer. However, Luis had already come up with an excuse. He explained that he had filmed the footage in the villa, which led to the killer following him. After seeing the killer's face, he remembered and then quickly reported to the police after losing the tail. The police saw Luis's testimony as all lies, but due to the lack of concrete evidence, they couldn't charge him. In the end, they had no choice but to release him. Shortly after, Luis used the money he earned to expand his team and upgrade his equipment using his own values to influence his staff. He trained more people who would stop at nothing just like him. This film was an inspirational one with a worldview that wasn't entirely correct. However, it was precisely because of this imperfection that the film became more grounded in reality. Luis, initially a newcomer to the industry, gradually discovered the inner workings of the news industry. As he began to achieve limited success, his sense of ethics slowly faded away. Perhaps many years from now, Luis could become a successful figure with a glamorous exterior. Who would ever guess that he was once a demon? This is where today's story ends. Thank you for watching the film. What did you think of it? Please leave a comment below.